Inspire Instructor podcast, where the learning never stops. Welcome, you wonderful people, to the Inspire Instructor Training podcast. We've got a great episode for you today, all about reversing. I'm joined by Emma Cottington, who is absolutely amazing, and we have some fantastic chats. So you've got a great episode in store for you today. But before we head over to the episode, I do just want to have a little talk about how we can help you with our Inspire Instructor Training membership. So with the membership, it's only £20 a month, and with the membership you get access to all of our courses. There is over 30 hours worth of content on the website. All of our courses, all of our previous Zooms that we've recorded. You then have access to any of our future Zooms, and we record twice a month. You can also then join our Facebook group and the community that we have over there of everybody supporting each other, and also you have myself and Diana on hand to answer any questions that you may need. So yeah, if you're interested in joining our membership, then head over to inspireinstructortraining.com. But for now, I hope you enjoy the show. So welcome to the podcaster Emma Cottington from Up Driving School, which is still one of my favourite driving school names, particularly the story behind it. So welcome, Emma.
Hello, welcome.
We're just going to leave people hanging. They can go back to your previous episode on the podcast if they want to hear the story about how Up Driving School was named. So we're going to carry on with our how-to series, and this is episode 3. And today we're going to be talking about how to teach reversing, and how me and Emma go about that. And I'm intrigued to find out, because I don't know how Emma goes about this, so I'm not sure whether we're going to be in sync or we're going to end up debating this, but my guesses will be pretty close. So yeah, I'm intrigued. So I'm going to start off with Emma. Just how do you go about teaching reversing?
I think with anything, it depends on the person who's in the driving seat. For me, so I typically have a learning agreement with my students that we come up with on lesson 1, and that is all about them sort of letting me know what they want from me as an instructor, what I can do to help them and support them, how they learn best, and all that type of stuff, if they know. A lot of people don't know, do they? But and I typically come up with, if we're thinking about reversing as a new topic on the lessons, typically have a conversation at the beginning about how they feel this is going to work for them best. And, how do they want to start reversing? What do they want to do? What do they want to achieve? What their goals are. And then we kind of go from there, really, based on that conversation.
Nice. I love the idea of the learning agreement, and it's in there within that learning agreement. Then obviously you've got the whole kind of how they like to learn, and that does change per whatever they're learning as well. Anyway, are you in that? So did you say that at the start of every lesson, or start of like from day one? Is that like a bigger thing, and then again at the start of every lesson, or?
Yeah, so typically I would do a larger learning agreement on the first lesson that I meet someone, and just sort of typically for 2 reasons, really. Sort of letting them know what kind of style I've got as an instructor, that I'm not necessarily gonna sit there and just feed them and they copy what I say, and how that sort of sits for them. And also kind of if there's anything that they want to tweak with that as well, if there's anything that they want to bring to the table of what's going to work best for them. So this might be a conversation that brings up, this person really likes demonstrations, or this person really likes to just sort of chat about a topic first and tell me what they know about it before we delve deeper, or this person might like me to give them a traditional briefing with a diagram, whatever it might be. But what I like to then do is, as lessons progress, and we may move on to a topic that we've not done before, like reversing, I'll kind of figure out with them whether that agreement is going to work for them or not for this particular topic. because I think depending on what the topic is, whatever you've agreed might change. Some people might go on junctions, no, I really want you to sort of talk me through this step by step because I'm a bit worried about it. Whereas with reversing, they might go, do you know what? I'm just gonna have a go at it. And the learning agreement might be different. So I like to kind of check in quite regularly as to whether what we've been doing so far is actually going to work for this new topic as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think particularly reversing, but I think everybody can learn anything different in different ways.
Mhm.
But I think reversing tops that list of this might be different how we go about this compared to how we go about roundabouts.
Yeah.
It's probably for me the one that I think you can really be truly experimental with. I think you can with some of the other stuff, but there's an element of safety involved.
Yeah.
Like going to experiment how roundabouts go can sometimes be a bit worrying.
Yeah.
Whereas with this, you can put them in a safe environment and let them experiment, which I love doing. As long as that is how they like to learn. So with before we go into then how we do that, with this learning sort of kind of agreement, is it agreed like where you're going to introduce these sort of kind of topics, or is that just kind of happens as it goes on naturally? And if it is how it goes on naturally, is there a particular point you decide to bring in reversing? I know instructors do tend to sort of kind of introduce this at different times, and I know it's different for every single pupil, but I know, but also instructors do probably have their preferred time they bring this in.
Yeah. And I think if you'd have asked me this question probably 5 or 6 years ago, I'd probably answer it very different to how I'm going to answer it now. I think, I don't have a particular structure to how I tackle the various elements of the syllabus, if for want of a better word, that we have. I typically, when I'm doing the learning agreement, kind of one of the questions I ask is, what do you think you're going to learn in the time that we're learning to drive? So they will typically list a set of topics themselves. They'll come up with all these various things that they feel that they're gonna, add to. I typically ask them at that point as well about what their driving's going to look like once they've passed the test. What are they going to be doing with a car when I'm not there anymore? And reversing tends to now for me naturally sort of happen. I don't think there's a particular place I tend to put it, or I suppose it typically happens probably after we've covered things like junctions, crossroads, traffic lights, maybe some mini roundabouts. Um, it typically happens there, but I wouldn't, without actually looking back on everybody and actually thinking, figuring out, that's just kind of come off the top of my head, really. But yeah, I don't have a particular place for it.
No, I think,
Um,
like I say, it depends on the pupil's preference. The reason I'm
yeah,
kind of asking is because I hear sometimes like you get pupils from other instructors, and the thing they complain about is, well, I've been doing this many hours and I haven't even done any reversing.
yeah,
And I always find that really interesting because partly because I always think, well, if you'd have been doing those hours with me, you probably wouldn't have done any reversing either. But it's just maybe managing their expectations and this idea that I have to start ticking off the reversing. And for me, there's probably kind of two schools here that you can introduce it relatively early and actually use it as a clutch control, car control, like a place to practice those things when you just happen
yeah,
to also be reversing. I was talking to an instructor the other day who said that they like to actually do it on their first lesson. So if they're in a car park on that first lesson practicing around, then they do what they do forwards, backwards. So it
yeah,
just takes that fear out of it. So when it comes to then putting cars in spaces and being more accurate with your reversing, it's not this big deal anymore because we've had this play around on the first lesson. So I like that sort of kind of school of thought, but then I also like the fact that if you as you leave it later, they built up this awareness of the car and understanding of where they are on the road. So actually, they then maybe find the maneuvering a lot easier. So you maybe then have to spend less time on it. So it's kind of like finding that balance for which one works for the pupil, or maybe just filtering it in bits. But there is probably no right answer. It depends on the
Yeah.
pupil. And if their motivation is I need to tick off this reversing, then let's do it because otherwise it's going to be there on the mind and they're going to feel like this and like they're not going to feel like they're engaged in the learning process. So yeah, if they're eager, then go take them reversing. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that sort of sprung to mind then was I had a young lady, probably, God, it must be going back about 5 years now, and she lived down a very narrow farm track, and there was no turning circle at the bottom. So it was either in and reverse out or reverse in and then drive out. Like there was no option to turn around anywhere or anything like that, particularly if a mum and dad's cars was in the very small driveway at the bottom when you got to it. So she had to learn reversing really, really early on because we had no choice. That was the only way in and out of her property. And I think it depends. And I think that's probably why I include what's driving life like for you in the learning agreement. How quickly can we start to tackle these things because it's going to be prominent in the lessons maybe, like it was for Alice. But I think it's very, very much a preference thing. I think a lot of the ones that we get, and like you said, they've come from other instructors and said, I've had this many lessons and I've not done any reversing yet. It makes me wonder whether there's a worry or a concern for them that maneuvers are going to take them a long time to grasp. And the feeling that, I'm running out of time and I want more time to practice these things. Or I've heard that parallel parking's awful and I'm going to need at least a month to practice that. All the different stories that they come with. It makes me wonder whether that plays a part as well.
Yeah, I think also that when you've been talking about this learner agreement, I think there's an element of just lack of communication there. Like, and if you've got this good rapport with the pupil, then they would feel they would feel like able to talk to you about it and say, "But can we do some reversing? I'm worried about it." And so
Yeah.
the communication might not be there, or even I've talked to people about this before about the communication in the pupil understanding the progress they are making because
Yeah.
we all have pupils that take longer to get out onto the main road or take longer to do what are maybe seen as the big tick offs, like the first time I do roundabouts and the first time I do a parking, and they take a bit longer, but with good communication, good self-reflection, that they're able to see that they are making progress, albeit maybe smaller than some of their friends. So yeah, I think it's all about talking to your pupils about these things and like I said, introducing it when it feels necessary. And I love that story of the person reversing back because even though that's quite an extreme
Yeah,
example,
it's a very extreme example.
but
Yeah, I've
everyone
never come
has the
across it
whole
before.
like everyone. I've taught loads of pupils who live in a cul-de-sac, and
Mhm.
the temptation when you go to pick them up is to turn the car around and then pick them up facing the right way. And then when we drop them off, they drop you off facing the wrong way, and you're the one that goes and turn around. And I
Yeah.
think the earlier in those moments, if they have a turnaround place that you need to deal with, or a parallel parking on their road, or whatever the situation is, the earlier you can introduce that, if they have like that specific need for where they that live or work, like you said, if you're asking them at the start about their driving life, the the less scary it is when it comes to having to do it in real life, and it's just something they've been doing like regularly. Like I love it when I have people that I meet in a car park or whatever because you don't ever have to teach them pay parking because they just do one at the end of every lesson. By the time
Yeah.
they go off driving into the world, they've done loads and they're just happy and it's not a thing. So yeah, I think introducing that sort of kind of real life stuff is crucial. But yeah, this country lane thing is quite funny.
Yeah, it is. It was very, very sort of extreme. And we don't have a lot of that around here, really. So we don't get a lot of that type of stuff. But yeah, when I first went to it, I actually thought I was in the wrong place. When I went to pick her up, I was like, this can't be it. Because
I
it
can
was
imagine.
really, really weird, yeah.
Yeah, I can
But
imagine that. Oh yeah, that should be that's a whole podcast. Picking up the first time picking up a pupil and trying to find their house.
oh yeah.
That's a challenge. So let's say we get to this point where you've decided you're going to teach reversing, next lesson's reversing, we've set the goal. Um, what does that lesson look like in your car?
Um, Firstly, I want to find out what kind of reversing they want to do. Because and you'll get all sorts of weird and wacky answers sometimes, I find. Some want to dive straight in there, let's do a parallel park, let's do a bay park, whatever. Some will just want to reverse in a straight line. That will be enough of a goal set initially. But I think like what you said earlier, it's the one for me that you can experiment more because we can keep it safe. You know, that practice area, it can be very controlled to allow it to be safe for them to have that sort of experiment. um I typically start any topic really with, well, what do you know about it already? You know, and let it be led from there really. And fill in, you know, they often don't make the connection of things like clutch control at junctions and how that might help us here, clutch control on hills and how that might help us here. You know, they don't often make those sort of connections, so it's quite nice to have a conversation about how these things all interlink. um I'm a mind map user, as you know, so there's a lot of mind maps go on in my car. And my mid pupils are just kind of so used to it now. They all kind of typically, there's not many that don't engage with it really. They really like to do that. And we work from that. We work from that point of, right, okay, what do we already know? What do we feel like we need to know? Is there anything that I can add value here that I feel is going to be important before we go off and just sort of let them play? But yeah, I typically don't teach reversing. I typically don't teach any of the maneuvers. They pretty much teach themselves in my car. Let them figure it out, let them have a conversation about it, let them do it. And if it goes wrong, it goes wrong. And that's our next sort of stepping stone to what we do next to make any changes.
Yeah, yeah. When I said at the start, I thought we might be on the same wavelength, but I think we are. So, um, yeah, no, my first reversing tends to be a really big open car park.
Mm.
Take the maneuvers out of it, and we just go make the car move around backwards.
Yeah.
And there's like a little loop that some instructors take their pupils to this car park for their first lesson to go around that loop forwards. I do it backwards.
Yeah.
So we're literally just driving the car around
Yeah. We've
backwards.
got a little like figure of eight where you can use on a car park for
Yeah,
reversing.
and you
Yeah.
just make the car go that way. How do you think you can do that? And because you're in such a big, like when you're reversing into a bay for the first time and maybe there's a car nearby, there's a big deal about that decision to steer left or right. Even without the cars, it's just like that once you put white lines there, they want to finish in the white lines.
Yeah.
And if so, it puts a lot of pressure on that decision, which then tends to make them sort of kind of freeze up and not make the decision. Whereas when you've got such a big open space and yeah, we want to go over there towards the left, they can just go, I'm going to do this and see what happens. And then if it
Yeah.
goes left, they go, yeah, I was right. Or if it doesn't, they go, okay, that's not right. If I do this
Mm.
way, it'll probably go left. And then they work
Yeah.
out.
I find as well in my experience with that when you're in that open space, they typically don't have that second guess almost of which way they need to turn the steering wheel. It's almost a little bit more natural that they'll steer the way that they want the car to go without really kind of thinking about it. It's like you said, when we put them into a smaller box and say, right, you need to be there in that box, that the overthinking starts to happen. Or they start to think about what the front of the car's doing more than what the back of the car's doing, and then the whole thing gets confused, and now we're steering the opposite way. And I think it's really, really good as well in a nice open space because it allows them to understand the sort of turning circle of the steering, that it's going to be very different to what it is when you're going forward because of which wheels. A lot of them don't understand which wheels they're driving, you know. So I think having that open space allows them to kind of understand how much steering they're going to need reversing in comparison to what they might need going forward.
Yeah. But and I think that can happen organically in a
Yeah.
way like it's if you just let them play for 10, 15 minutes, you'll see that they will start adjusting that steering and without any input from you. And I think actually, if you try and tell them about it, it's then a thing they've got to remember. Whereas if they just
Absolutely.
discover it becomes just a thing that they now know and they do and adjust for. It was interesting you talked about the whole front of the car because I see that a lot come up on lessons. And I even see people like instructors mentioning the front of the car as like, oh, as a reference or something. And I think that would probably be one of my tips for this how to teach reversing is forget about the front of the car as much as possible. Yeah, maybe like to judge whether you're in a straight line. I find looking forward can be really helpful there, but not never. It's never about which way do I want to make the front of the car go. The
Mm.
second that comes into play, you've lost them with which way to steer. It's
Yeah.
always about the back. What do you want the back of the car to do? And then, if at all possible, get them to turn around when they're answering that question.
Yes.
Because I find that like,
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. I mean, if you think about it logically, at what point do we start talking about the back of the car at a junction? We don't, unless we've had an issue with the back of the car at the junction. So unless it becomes an issue, why are we mentioning it? It's not what they're doing. They're not driving that part of the car at that in that moment. And I think it would almost be like us doing a junctions lesson and naturally bringing in what the back of the car's doing. We are just going to cause more confusion because they've got enough to think about, and they're trying to figure out what's going on anyway. So for me, we wouldn't discuss the back of the car at junctions. So why are we discussing the front of a car when we're reversing? Unless it becomes an apparent learning point.
yeah, and I think also that looking behind is so crucial. I quite often when I have pupils who overthink that steering, and it is an overthinking. I think if they do it instinctively, it nearly always goes right. I get them to just look where they want the car to go, and
Yeah,
then steer where you're looking. Because
yeah,
if you want the car to go right, you'll naturally look out the back right window, so steer that way. And then if you want
yeah.
the car to go left, you'll look over the left window. Chris Benstead came up with we did a Facebook Live with him recently, and he explained I don't know how well tested this theory is, but it was really interesting that he was talking about how girls typically struggle this with more, and threw in a massive bunch of caveats before we got attacked by Diana. Um, but he pointed out that actually girls use mirrors more. So you're doing makeup and not just look in mirrors, but like use mirrors, as in like to put your makeup on. Whereas guys don't do that.
Yeah,
And when you are using a mirror, everything you do is opposite. And so yeah, I can't even do it. So because
yeah,
I can't do the makeup. And he says potentially that what's happening there is you have built up this idea that when you're looking in a mirror, everything is opposite. And so this
yeah.
is the solution to that is then to take the mirror out of it and turn around and look behind you.
Mhm.
Um, and it was interesting, just like the concept that potentially that's what's happened because you've built up this over years and years of experience in a different field
Yeah.
to brought it into the car and it's then confused what's happening in the car, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, it is an interesting point. It is something that I've discussed on lessons before actually with learners. I didn't realize that Chris had done that. But we have this perception that backwards is going to mean opposite,
Uh-huh.
and it doesn't necessarily, well, it doesn't in this case mean that. If you want the back of the car to turn left when you're reversing, you're going to steer left. And a lot of people do the opposite because they think because it's reversing, because we're going backwards, we have to switch it. Um, I even had somebody, and I think it was only probably in the last, it's recent because I've never had any, because I was actually quite surprised. I thought I was getting to a point in my career where nothing would surprise me or something, something new had been said. And she actually said to me, I didn't realize that reversing meant going backwards. I thought reversing meant I had to do the opposite. And I was like, okay. And we ended up having a really quite in-depth conversation about that, how she took the wording of, because obviously we've got a lot of words in the English language, unfortunately, that have a double meaning. and she took the opposite meaning of reversing. So where we was talking about, or where I was talking about reversing as in the car going backwards, she was talking about reversing as in we do the opposite. So she thought everything we did when we was reversing had to be the opposite. So if we wanted the car to go left, we had to stay right because that would be the opposite. And it was a really fascinating conversation with her. It's actually my niece. And it was a really interesting conversation. And I was like, I have never come across that before. Um, but it undone a lot of the confusion for her because she was just on a different description of reverse than I was.
It's interesting. It just shows to goes to kind of show how you can't ever assume anything.
Nope.
And it shows why it's so important to just ask them their opinion, ask them what's going on in their head, because you just assume all the time, and something
Mhm.
like that. And I think what we forget as well, that we do this day in, day out. Like, we know these terms, and I know that that's a relatively sort of kind of term that a lot of people would know, but
Yeah.
it can happen with anything we do. There's so many terms that we use, and we just assume that they have the same meaning to the pupil, and so it just shows why it's so important that we are checking in with them all the time, that they've understood what we've what we've been talking about, but not by
Yeah.
saying, does that make sense? Because I was on Terry's podcast, and we had this conversation. Don't say, does that make sense? Because it's so easy to just go, yeah,
Yeah,
and not
absolutely.
actually understand.
It really is. I mean, that conversation came about because I said to her, because I could see the confusion, I could see she was getting really sort of frustrated with it. And I just said to her, what does reversing mean to you? That was it. That was all I said. And that whole conversation just come from there. But like I said, it was a really fascinating conversation to kind of really get into her mind as to, what we were actually trying to achieve.
I love it. It was really interesting actually when you started telling the story. I was like, I bet Emma asked her, what does reversing mean to her? To get to that point, because I thought, how did you start that conversation? I was like, actually, I know the question she would have asked. And it just shows it's so important to ask these questions. So let's get into the. We've talked about how we maybe both would introduce reversing as just a concept of reversing, and I think this is quite important that if you give them, it goes back to episode 1. We were talking to Lee, and he was talking about how when we're teaching roundabouts, what's really important is they have all the skills. And I think the same applies to here. If you're going to go and teach any of these topics like parallel parking, bay parking, they need the skills to do it, which
Mhm.
is why I think it's really important that we just spend a bit of time playing around with the car and getting used to going backwards. Um, but then at some point you do have to go, right, let's go and do that in a car park and reverse the car. Do you, and I think I already know the answer to this, but do you have a particular method for this, a preferred way of doing it, or anything like that?
No. No is the answer to that. Again, I think if you'd have asked me 5, 6 years ago, I would have said yes. I think I taught everybody did it exactly the same way coming out of my car because I taught it a particular way. I certainly don't now. I know absolutely know the value of them finding it out for themselves, which way. Um, and it's interesting to have conversations with other instructors who do only have a certain way, and the conversation that they have is that they've got a particular person who's struggling, and how they're pushing onto the pupil that it's the pupil's fault because they can't understand this reference point, or they can't understand how we count 3 lines and then do whatever they're doing, or whatever it is that they're doing. And I can see the frustration from the pupil because clearly that method isn't what is going to make sense to them. Um, and also we've got to think about, my car isn't their car when they've passed the test. So, this whole reference point is straight out the window as soon as they get in their own car anyway.
Yeah. Or if you get to the end of the car park and there isn't 3 lines before the
Yeah.
space you want to go
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
to. The yeah, and I think the beauty of so obviously talking about bay parking there, and I think the beauty of being able to just reverse however you want to reverse into that space with maybe some different ways actually, because it's
Mhm.
not the like I would argue that probably the two main methods are the free line method or swing out to maybe 45-ish degrees and then
Yeah.
reverse back. Um, but in reality, I want them to be able to do a bit of both and something in between as well, and or even just drive around to straight and reverse back in a straight line. I want them to be able to do whatever they can to get into that space, however possible, because in this moment, we're not just teaching them bay parking, we're teaching them to maneuver the car backwards into a tight space. We just happen to be using white lines today, but next time it could be a country lane or
Mhm.
reversing into a driveway where there isn't free lines to line up with. We're just teaching them that skill.
Yeah.
Um, so what what I want to kind of do now is just get into a little bit more of the detail of how we go about that, because I can hear people listening to this going, well, I do teach a method and it works. Um, but and then they don't maybe necessarily know how to go about that. How do they start? How would you do that then? If like, how would you get a pupil to from never doing reversing to being able to quite comfortably park the car
Mhm.
without enforcing a method on them?
I think I think a lot of it comes down to our essential coaching skills. I think if you've built that relationship up with your student and you've got that rapport and you're using your questioning techniques and you're aware of your feedback and reading things like body language and things like that, and you're able to pull on a range of ways of supporting them, is that going to be through, do they want to see a picture? Do they want to see a video on YouTube? Do they want to read a book about it? Do they want me to talk them through it? Do they want to see me do it? But generally I start the whole conversation with, I mean, let's take bay parking for an example. So on an empty car park generally, because we've got that experimental thing going on, so we're keeping it as safe as possible. Um, okay, so from where we are now, tell me how you feel you would get your car from where we are now into any of these bays. And just sort of have a conversation, but have a conversation where you are listening, you know, not a conversation where you are waiting to put your knowledge in there. And you're just waiting for them to stop so that you can fill in the gaps, because it's really interesting listening to some of them, as to what they're going to do and how they're going to go about it. And it fascinates me that they'll come up with all sorts of different ways and not one of them are wrong. They all get in that bay. We might not have good, clear observations to begin with because they're really concentrating on getting in there, or it might be a little bit too fast or whatever. But the whole part of our job there is that we've took them to somewhere that those things can happen and we can manage the risk quite easily. So I always start with, how are you going to get your car from where we are now to in any of these bays? And then typically get them to narrow down which one they fancy having a go at. And then really just let them have a go. And then it's all about reflection. So did that go as planned? Are you where you wanted to be? Is this the bay that you wanted to be in? Or should we have been in three bays that way? Where was you thinking you were going to be to where you've ended up? Were you happy with the speed of your car? Were you happy that there wasn't anybody, around us at the time? Are you happy with your accuracy here? I've had so many people who are in between those two white lines on the very first attempt, but are so critical of themselves because it's not perfectly square, and it's the first attempt. So keeping it positive as well, being really, positive about what they've just achieved by themselves. We've had no play in it, and it just naturally kind of works from there.
Yeah, right, absolutely. I think it's also important to, and when you're doing that self-reflection, and I actually put this up on a lesson recently, that it is okay for us, because I think when we hear coaching, we hear just like get out of the way, don't offer any support, and actually, as much as possible, yeah. But there's also an element within coaching about raising someone's awareness. They may not be aware of an issue, and then go back to coaching whatever issue you've raised. And we were on a session where we were coaching really well through this parking situation, but effectively the same thing kept happening. We kept being too close to the right, over the line, and the pupil was doing the same thing every time and kept saying, "Well, I'll go a bit slower, I'll do this," and they were kept throwing out options, but just wasn't really recognizing the issue
Yeah.
that we were doing the whole thing too far to the right. Um, and so I jumped in and sort of kind of raised that and just kind of said, "What do you?" And then said, "What do you think about that?" And then she came up with some options to, so we just kind of, it's okay to kind of mention stuff, I think is the point, rather than blindly trying it again and again and hoping that it goes better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where your reading of body language and things would come in and that communication, because what we don't want to happen is that we disempower them through their empowerment.
Yeah.
We don't want to take away what we're trying to give, because what can happen there is that we're trying to coach, we're trying to push, we're trying to get them to do it all. So we're trying to empower them to achieve these things. But that for me can be a fine line sometimes when we're learning something new, because we can push and push and push as a coach to try and empower them to be in control here and make all the decisions and figure it out for themselves. But at what point does that become frustrating? Because as soon as we go into that, actually the whole thing's probably going to start to shut down soon. And we've completely lost the aim of that empowerment. And in fact, we're going quite the opposite way and we're disempowering. And it can become quite frustrating. I think for me, in those situations, what I typically tend to do there is still engage them in a coaching conversation of so rather than, because again, going back a few years, I would have probably been quite quick to, and I think I definitely would have been as I was going through the transition to client-centered learning, where I would have been quite good at getting them to do it initially. And then as soon as something wasn't going right, I wanted to fill it in. I wanted to say, this is what it is, this is why it's not working for you. But I try to keep on that same track by maybe offering a solution, but through a question. So, your example there, I potentially might have said something like, how do you think our start position affects our finish position? Or something along those lines. So that I'm not necessarily delivering the information that they need to correct this, but I'm kind of leading them down the path.
Yeah, I see. I think that's kind of how the conversation went, actually, is I'd raise this awareness of the fact we just kept finishing too far to the right. Um, Offered her the chance to come up with some solutions, and she'd sort of kind of said the same things, and then she just don't know what to do differently. So I then went to the idea of offering her. I didn't actually suggest any option. I said I gave some options. So I was like, well, we could have a think about this. We could try starting a bit further forward. We could try doing the whole maneuver a little bit more to the left. We could try turning faster, try turning earlier.
Mm.
We could try cutting the corner a bit if you feel like if you're trying to avoid the line. And it gave her just all these sort of kind of things. And I said, which one of those makes sense to you the most? And then went and tried whichever one she chose. And I think it ended up working, or it didn't. And then we tried another one of the options, or a mixture of the options. But it's
Yeah.
still putting it back in her court to decide how we're going to go about it. Because I just threw out a few things that I know work for other pupils, but I still wanted it to be what made sense in their mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes I mean, how many times do you see conversations either on podcasts or people talking about it online where people can't tackle the I don't know student, you know? And we've got to really start as an industry to think, or we have, in my opinion, that sometimes people just don't know, and it's okay that they don't know. I think we barrel down but they should know. We're supposed to be coaching these answers out of them, and that yeah we have, but and I would certainly try those things first. But there's got to come a point where we've got to look at this person sat at the side of us, and we've got to see them becoming frustrated, becoming impatient, probably, or worked up or even upset because we're trying to get them to find the solution. And really, they have come to a blank in their mind. And we might have something like I typically might use a mind map or something there or something like that. There might be other tools that we can use before we just give them the answer. Or we could lean into, things like would a demonstration help? Would seeing a diagram help? So all of these different things, we can still offer solutions where they can pick what works for them. But we really have got to start reading the person sat at the side of us, and recognize when that I don't know genuinely becomes they don't know, because we do not know things. We don't know everything.
Yeah,
None of
no,
us do.
and I think that's what I sensed in this lesson, and why I offered some options,
Mm.
uh, and I think offering those options is very different to suddenly saying, okay, now turn at this point.
This
Uh,
is what you need to do. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
and
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
that can be where it can then be that difference to offering that solution. So shall we just move a little bit on to and I guess this is going to be very similar because my guess is teach all of the reversing very similar to this process. Is there any, do you do anything different for parallel parking? Just because I know that's one that a lot of people struggle with.
Um, no, I wouldn't say that I do. I typically start that lesson the same way. What is your understanding of this? How do you think we're going to achieve it? A great question that I like to use is teach me how to do it. Talk me through like I don't know what to do. Um, and they come up with some great stuff there, as to how they would talk me through doing this or teach me how to do it. Um, but yeah, I don't think, I mean, obviously for us from a risk management situation, we're typically in a more risky situation than we would do for bay parking. We're now on the road typically rather than on a car park where we could even go to a car park that's got absolutely nothing on there at all. Um, Obviously we've still got the management of risk in the type of road that we're going to do this parallel park on. So I suppose there's an increase in risk, but generally my method would be to start with that same conversation of what do we know, what do we not know, how do you want to go about this? And not assume that we're going to do it the same way as we've done the other maneuvers if we've done other maneuvers by that point. Because I think the change of location for a learner driver from learning bay parking on an empty car park to even maybe progress into a car park where they've gone in between two parked cars and the car park's quite busy. I think to then go to being on parallel park, if they've done it that way round, can still be quite daunting. So I think it's good to just check in and not assume that we're going to do this the same way as we've done others, because it might be different in terms of how they want to go about it.
Yeah, like you say, they might want more support, so they're not because they haven't got that time necessarily to be hanging around working it
Yeah,
out in their head. Yeah, absolutely. You said about not doing it in car parks, but actually I have quite a few times done parallel parking in car parks
yeah.
because you can just pull up parallel to the pavement and go put the car next to the pavement because the car that you're parking around's got nothing to do with the maneuver.
Nope, it's
Um,
not.
and actually, again, that really makes it about just maneuver the car that way and finish
Yeah,
facing the way that you started facing. I like the fact you get them to teach you that you teach me how you would do this, and I think I do something similar, and I get them to visualize how it's going to go, or you've seen other people do this. How do they do it? Like that sort of
yeah,
kind of vibe, and so they've got this visual picture. I've got quite a good video of me teaching my daughter parallel parking for the first time up on YouTube, and it's amazing because I can't remember it exactly, but I remember the when I when I first said to her, like, how do you think you go about this? And she was sort of kind of like, I don't know, never done it before. And then I obviously like coached around to kind of giving me some sort of concept. And we just went and had a go. And she didn't believe she was going to get it. But within, I don't know, four or so parallel parts, she was just parking every time and it was fine. Because she just worked it out. And so
Yeah.
it really just it shows nicely that you just take the method out of it. There was an interesting bit in the middle of it where she'd watched a TikTok video with a method,
Mm,
and you could see her trying to remember the method, and that threw her. And
yeah.
so I was like, okay, let's throw that out of the window and then
Mm.
just do what you think you need to do. The next one nailed it. Um,
Yeah.
it's really
I,
interesting.
I I find in my experience that they typically will watch like a video or a TikTok for parallel parking
Yeah,
over any of the others. Um, and I don't know whether there's like a social element to that, like the friends are saying they struggled with it, or the parents have said, "Oh, I always hated doing that," or still do, or whatever. Um, and yeah, I often find that they come more with a method for parallel park than they do with any of the other maneuvers. Um, and it's quite interesting, but it's really it is that perception because they spend more time trying to remember what the method was than they do actually trying to park the car. And it can be really um interesting to watch them figure it out and ditch the method and go, yeah, actually that's too much hassle trying to remember that and do what I'm doing as well.
yeah. I remember picking up a pupil once from another instructor, and we went to do parallel parking. And my first question was, "Have you done this before? How do you go about this?" He goes, "Well, I've got this method from my instructor." And generally, if they come with a method from another instructor, I'm not going to get in the way of that because if it's worked for them and they've adapted it in their own mind, I don't want to be the one getting in the way of that. So we pulled up next to the parked car, and I went, and she wasn't doing anything. I was like, "You okay?" She goes, "I can't remember the method." um, I was like, "Now I'm here, I can't remember what to do." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, that kind of shows the problem with the
Yeah.
fact that you're even the word remember there is instantly the issue." So I said, "See what you can do. Just like go give it a go. Like do what you think's best, sort of kind of thing."
Yeah.
And then you could see, and the moment I always see when they're doing parking that I know they're going to get it is when they start wiggling the steering wheel around. So it's not like
Yes.
it's not an exact turn and then hold it still until I get to my place. It's when it's like a little bit this way, a little bit that way,
Yeah.
like you see experienced drivers do. And that's when you just know, yeah, this person's got reversing.
Yeah.
Like because they're just adjusting for what's necessary in the moment. So I just want to move on a little bit here. To I'm not gonna talk about forward bay parking and parking pulling up on the right because I feel like we're just gonna have the same vibe for both of
Yeah.
them. Um, but I think maybe this will link a little bit to pulling up on the right, particularly, I think more than the others. Do you do any sort of kind of reversing sessions that are a bit more real life? And actually, even with the parallel parking and the bay parking, so like how do you make them real life rather than test focused?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one, it would come to my learning agreement, like what it would be part of that learning agreement of what life is going to be like for them. And we try to, and if that includes obviously maneuvering, then we do that. I actually live in a cul-de-sac myself. Um, so I will purposely kind of get them to drive down roads like this and go, oops, it's a dead end. What are we going to do to get out of this? I'm sure some of them are convinced that I just don't know my way around places, but yeah, it's great to kind of take them into different scenarios that would require them to use reversing skills, but not in a test focused type of maneuver. And in the past, I've actually had like learners thank me for that after they've done the test. Because on two separate occasions, I've had one who's had to reverse down the road because there was a bin lorry blocking the road, and it was easier for them to reverse than the bin lorry, and they had to do that on the test. And another one was they gone down this particular route on the test, and it had been closed because there was an accident, and the whole road was closed by the fire brigade. So they had to do a turn in the road and come back and go back round. There was no other way round. And in both occasions, yes, the examiner potentially may have supported, but they didn't need to because my learners knew what to do. And that's purely through just learnt experience on lessons, just making it part of the lesson. Not making it a structure, not making it a topic, not making it a thing, just literally, right, how are we going to get out of this? What are you going to do to get out of this situation? If I wasn't here right now, what are you going to do? And it's quite interesting to watch them figure it out.
Yeah, no, I've had a couple like that. I had it was a mock test actually, but we'd just done the parallel park, and then they turned around and had to effectively parallel park to get out of the way of the car coming towards us, and it was uphill, and everyone was
Mm.
watching them and stuff, and they just nailed it, and I was like, yeah, this person's ready. And that same person, then I spoke to them a few weeks after they passed their test, and they said, I'm so glad you taught reversing the way you taught reversing, because I went to my in-laws and I had to reverse all the way down the driveway, and it wasn't a straight line, it just like gently curved. And I think if I didn't understand how to maneuver the car, I just wouldn't have been able to do it. And so I think it's stuff like that that's really
Mm.
shows that take the maneuver out of it, take the test out of it, and just get them to be able to maneuver the car backwards as pretty much as
Yeah,
much as they can forwards.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I vividly remember on my driving lessons that I hated parallel park. I just couldn't get it. I couldn't understand what my car was doing. I couldn't understand what I had to do with the steering wheel and I was still like that on my test, still had that on my going on my test. Um, and I remember thinking, I am never going to parallel park in my life. I don't know why I'm learning this. I don't know what's going on. I'm never going to do this maneuver ever. And that was all fine and well till I bought my first house and moved out of my parents' house because my parents' house, very similar to where I live now, a little cul-de-sac. We had driveways and we could park on the front. Very easy for me to just pull up, turn the car around in the bottom of the road and off I went. Then when me and my husband bought our first house, it was a narrow road, terraced houses. We had little gardens, but no driveway. So we had to park on the road. So my option was parallel park into the one space that was available that was probably about 2 inches bigger than my car, or park in the next street and walk. And I was like, well, I'm not going to be walking. So, and I almost sort of had to sort of teach myself how to do it because I had such a block with it on my lessons. And then I didn't do it, purposely avoided it for 3 years after I passed my test, And I just remember thinking to myself when I was qualifying that I would never have somebody leave my car not comfortable and confident with reversing because of what it had done to me and how I was as a driver when I first started.
Yeah, I think I sort of kind of resonate because I got good at parallel parking because I moved into a street where I had to do it every day.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
same.
I think on that note, the moving it, like making it real life, it is crucial for that, and it's something I was challenging my pupils for too as well, as like post test, because you know that when they get to the car park for the first time, they're going to chicken out and drive forward into the space at the far end of the car park. And I allow them the far end of the car park, but I do challenge them for the first 3 months, 4 months, whatever, to reverse in. Any opportunity you get, reverse into the car, because what I want them to do is do it enough times so that it just doesn't feel weird. Then
Yeah,
you can start choosing whether you reverse in or drive in for whatever particular reasons you want to do that, because there are times where driving in is more beneficial.
yeah,
But I want them to be able to have the choice. And if they chicken out and always drive in, someday they'll have to reverse it and they won't have that skill set anymore, because it doesn't matter what you've done with them on
mm,
their lessons. If they choose not to do it post test, that skill will go. And it's the same with parallel parking. Like whenever you get the opportunity to do a parallel park, like jump on it, because you don't want it to be a big deal when you have to do it. So I'm always sort of kind of encouraging them to do that. You said about the turnaround lesson, I do exactly the same thing. Like we drive down the road and I'm like, oh, well, we're lost again, are we? So I love doing that to people's. The other things I do actually to make it real though, is things like we have quite a lot of country lanes around here. So I will take them down narrow country lanes and then make them reverse back to the passing point.
Yes.
It's quite enough road that we're not going to meet anyone, or if they are, we can just drive on. That's fine. But it's that sort of kind of thing because around here that is a big deal. Like it's and something that a lot of people sort of kind of have anxiety over is like, what if I meet someone in a country lane? I'm like, well, let's go find out. um,
Yeah.
uh, Same on meeting traffic roads. Like if you've got a quiet enough housing estate,
Mm.
imagine we've missed the meeting traffic, the pull-in spot, and we have to reverse back. Let's go do that. So I think it's make it as real as possible, like all these
Yeah.
scenarios.
Yeah, it's that I like playing the game of what if in my car. What if, such and such a thing happens? What are you gonna do? What if? I love playing what if games because I think, it is impossible for us to address every scenario that these people are going to come across. We don't have an issue with passing places here. It's we're in a town, we're built up, we don't have that. Any what we would class as rural roads around here are reasonably still quite wide, and we're quite easily can pass each other. It's not the biggest challenge is the fact that the speed limits are maybe a little bit higher and there's a few more bends than normal, but that's as rural as we get
We
within,
call them motorways.
yeah, well, that's it, So it swings and roundabouts, but it's impossible for us as instructors to tackle every scenario that they're possibly going to face because one, we might not have the availability to, within a time frame that suits. Um, and two, it's similar to like blue lights, isn't it? Dealing with blue lights. We can't force that to happen. It's one of those things that we can't make happen. It happens if it happens. So it's great to play that game of what if, and reversing is a great topic for what if. What if you can't get out here? What are you going to do about it? How is reversing going to help you in this scenario or whatever it might be? Because it does bring in that thought process, and I think it's tackling that analyzing behavior as well. That we're trying to instill in these learners because it's asking them, if I'm not here, what are you going to do? How are you going to get out of it? I mean, I've got an example. My parents we're really lucky. My parents have got a static caravan in the Lake District, so we spend quite a lot of time up there. And it's only about an hour and 15 from home, so it's really easy for us to get there. Last summer we was up quite in the North Lake District, and I was driving, and we had really narrow country lane passing places, and my passing place, or the last one I remember, was quite a distance back. A lady came towards me with her family in the car, and her passing place she'd only just passed. So it absolutely made sense that she reversed because it was much, much closer and less reversing for me to do, for her to do it. And we must have been on that road for, well, it felt like half an hour. It was probably only 10 minutes, but it was a long time. The traffic had started to build. I actually started to attempt to reverse to this other passing place because I'm thinking she's not going to do this. In the end, her and her husband ended up swapping seats, and he did it. And it always, when I see scenarios like this, it always gets me thinking about my students, how I don't want them to be in those scenarios when they pass the test, and there is only so much I can do from a time frame perspective and a situation and scenario perspective. But the more what if games we play, the more analysing and resilience we're building. And I think that's where this becomes important. And I think more so with reversing than anything else, really, because too many ADIs and PDIs are out there just teaching what might turn up on a test. And then that's not tackling the what if and the real life. People are much more likely to have to reverse because something can't get through or have to turn the car around in the road than they are to parallel park, is the reality. Now I get why that maneuver's in there over the turning the road now. I get it. But the reality is turning the road is very prevalent in real life driving, So we've got to teach it, or we've got to provide situations where they've got to think about it and use those skills to get out.
Yeah, I've had a very similar story where someone couldn't reverse back. I actually got out and ended up reversing their car for them. So the um and then the other side of that, you were saying about like not wanting your pupils to be in that scenario, and I was talking about teaching my daughter reversing the other day, a while back, and it was only about a week after she passed her test. I remember she rang me up and she said, "You would not believe what happened to me." And she was driving up to pick her little brother up from school, and the dustbin lorry was coming the other way, and
Mm.
she couldn't, and there's no way the dustbin lorry was reversing up this like road, and so she had to reverse right back down the road and back out of the way, and she did it, and she was so proud of herself that she'd done it, and like you said, this is what we're training them to do, is to be able to maneuver the car in that situation. And you mentioned there about turning the road. I quite like that turning the road isn't on the driving test,
Mhm.
partly because I think it then and you should be doing this anyway, but I think it gives you the opportunity to teach it in real world scenarios,
Yes.
not on the world's widest road in
Yeah.
this very sanitized way that's on a driving test. Now I definitely started teaching turning the road or turning the car. I just call it turning the car around. Basically
Yeah.
it's my getting lost lesson.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Mine too.
and the same with reversing around the corner. Like sometimes that's the option. Sometimes I put them on a road where turning the road isn't a very good idea, and so now we have to do reversing into the road. And it just and let and it's amazing when they look at the road and go, oh, I'll probably just reverse in there. I'm like, yes, do that.
That's what we're gonna do. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I love that sort of kind of, you can make it a bit more real now, and it's not this sort of kind of sanitized like test
Yeah.
situation, everyone trying to use the same corner and all of that sort of kind of stuff. So I like that it's not there, but I think obviously people need to still be out there teaching people to just get out of sticky situations, which I think has come up a lot today. So
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, it's rare that I see people doing these things anymore. There's an ideal little spot around here where it's a we've got lost scenario, and we'll pull up, and I'm like, right, okay, what we're going to get out of it, and they've got the option of turning the car around or reversing into the side street. They could either one of them would be more than efficient for the job, and I feel sorry for the learners who don't get provided these options and opportunities to do these things just because it's not part of the test anymore. It is part of the syllabus. There's a difference between the
yeah.
two, and it's getting very lost where people are becoming very test focused, unfortunately. But it is a great experience to just give them what if scenarios, particularly if you can make it a real world situation for where they're going to be part of their learning agreement, because if you've got that learning agreement with them, that's ultimately what you should be sticking with anyway, because otherwise they're going to be thinking, when we started these lessons, Emma said we were going to do this, this, and this. We've not done any of that. It's just important to provide those situations, really.
Yeah, I think the whole test focus thing is interesting because a lot of that's driven by the pupil, but a lot of that is communication. And I
Yes.
think, again, you go back to your learner agreement. My guess is part of that conversation at the start is about wanting them to become safe drivers and not just pass a driving test. So when you do get that sticking point and you do feel like you're, I don't know, you've got the test. The issue is, if the test is coming up, does the learner want to go and do parallel parking or go and do practice turning around? Like, most of the time, they want to go do parallel parking because they're not going to fail on turning around on their test. And so it's about, I suppose, structuring that. It's about making sure you got the right time frames and not booking that test too early. And like you say, having that communication with them all the way through, that certainly in my car, my goal is not to get them to pass a driving test. Like, I literally don't care about the driving test. It's just a little blip on the way.
Yeah.
And up until maybe about 2 weeks before it, where we do a little bit of focus stuff just to make sure they're prepared for the day. The but I think if you're communicating that all the way along, you don't get you don't get that fight back from pupils as much. You don't get that test focus as much from them, and they are more willing to sort of kind of do this sort of kind of post-test stuff, I think.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think, a lot of the time I don't find myself discussing um test or post test. I don't talk about those
Driving, yeah.
things. Yeah, I don't talk about those things with learner drivers. I don't talk about this is what you're going to do on your test. This is what you'll do in the real world because my focus isn't there. My focus is on teaching you to drive, you know, and if we're both collaborating on that, and that is part of the learning agreement, but if we're both collaborating on the fact that we are in this agreement to learn how to drive a car safely, then we don't have to kind of go, right, well, we're going to practice turning in the road here because that's all the only way we're going to be able to get out of the scenario, but it's not on your test, so just have a go with it anyway. It shouldn't be said in that way. It should just be right, you've driven down this road, it's a dead end, how are you going to get out of it? It should just be part of the lesson, part of the journey, not part of, we're going to do this, but it's not part of your test.
Yeah, no, I know, absolutely. Yeah, because then you will get fight back from it as well. Absolutely.
Yeah,
It feels like, well,
absolutely.
why
Why
am I
why
doing
are we
this
doing
extra
this when
stuff?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
You'll start, why are we doing this when it's not part of my test?
yeah, absolutely. So is there anything else you would like to add to our reversing chat? Anything we've not
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered everything that I would sort of talk about there, I think. I think for me, and I think that just goes to who I am. And I think it comes from a base more from that transpersonal coaching type person that I am, is that it doesn't matter what we're teaching, reversing, roundabouts, junctions, whatever it is, whatever the how-to topic is, the important thing is that you don't forget that the person sat next to you is a person, that they're not they're their own person. They're going to have their own way of figuring this out. They're going to have their own way of doing this. Some of them might want you to talk them through it word by word, and that's fine because that's what they want. But the important thing is that we're not barreling down our options and our learning styles and making them fit in. It's no matter what we're teaching, it's always going to be about what that person wants, what works for them. And from there, we can then figure out a way forward. I think that should always be the starting step.
100%. You mentioned your learner agreement thing a few times. Is that part of your learner's handbook thing, or is that slightly different?
It's absolutely not. No, it's because the learner driver logbook
That's what I was.
is more about the kind of their inner world. It's not something that I actually used when I wrote that book. I think if I was to go and revise that book, which is on my very large list of things to do that's on my whiteboard in front of me here, I would actually put a space for a learning agreement at the front, because I think it's so important. It's probably something that I've used for probably about 3 years now, maybe. Um, and it's something that changes all the time as well. It kind of changes and develops and things like that. It's basically a blank slate for both of us when we first get in the car. And it's mainly conversational based. But we do write a few key points down from it so that we've both got a copy of it. Um, but yeah, I think that when I've written the learner driver logbook, it's not something that I included in it then, but it's not something I typically probably use then. But it is something that in a revised copy I would definitely put in at the beginning somewhere.
Cool. Yeah, no, I couldn't remember if it was in there or not, but I can also imagine even though it's not, pupils who are using that logbook would be very open then to having that conversation anyway, because they're used to that sort of kind of reflection and the whole process of working through their own journey, which is what the logbook does there. So do you want to spend a second to tell everyone where they can find you for and what they can find you for?
Where they can find me and what for? Well, okay, so they can find me just by simply searching for Emma Cottington on social media, typically using Facebook more than anything else for work purposes. But my Linktree link, which I think you've got from last time, is probably the best place to get everything that I do, because that is just a collection of all the different types of walks of life that I have going on there, from driver training, learner drivers, the learner driver logbook, anything that I do from a mental health perspective is on there as well, and anything that I do from a holistics and coaching point of view.
Brilliant. It's quite a lot going on.
3 businesses I'm running at the minute, Phil.
I once described Chris Benstead as the man with many hats. I think you're the lady with many hats. Brilliant. Thank you very much for joining me and spending your wisdom with us.
Thanks for having me.
It's all right. Thank you. Inspire Instructor Podcast, where the learning never stops.